Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to discuss Anton Chekov, the Russian short story writer's story, Grief. And this story is about listening. Listening appears such an easy thing to do to all of us, but we do not know how to listen properly. We know from trying to really listen and trying to be listened to that it is not so. Even those of us who imagine ourselves to be good listeners fall short. We need to learn that the greatest gift we can bring to the listening process is to launch ourselves into commiseration, expressions of sympathy or support, and empathy, and help others to get out of the discomfort of pain. Great healing is available when we turn to one another and restore hope for us through simple conversations, when we listen to each other. Listening is such a simple act. It requires us to be present. We do not have to do anything else. We do not have to advise, we do not have to coach or sound wise. We just have to be willing to sit there and listen. If we can do that, we create moments in which real healing is available. Real deep healing through listening can be likened to a spiritual practice that involves developing awareness, some serious unlearning, and adopting new practices. For the spiritual discipline, it is essential for all of us to cultivate these practices. What are these practices? A comfort with silence. Silence with ourselves is essential, first of all. Then a non-verbal empathy. Because generally what we do sometimes, if someone is sharing his grief with us, we start talking incessantly, continuously. No, we don't have to talk. We have simply to listen. And then finally, we have to be wholly present to another person. So this is about listening, and we all of us need to be present while we are listening to our fellow human beings. Anton Pavlovich Chekov is an eminent Russian short story writer whose writings carry influences of the wretched childhood and harsh experiences he underwent during his formative years. Childhood is formative. This made him state sorrowfully that there was no childhood in my childhood. His intense and powerful observations of shabbiness and miseries of human life and subsequent consciousness of suffering and isolation that mankind endured all around him led to Chekov's emergence as a literary painter of futility and despair that characteristically marks his stories. Especially his story Grief explores human grief and need for human compassion for a grieving human heart, whose attempts to talk about his son's unexpected death are relentlessly rebuffed. But he finds an animal more empathetic in an unusual manner. The author's sense of sorrow at man's inhumanity to man and his compassion for the lonely and the downtrodden is reflected in this disturbing tale. It leaves all of us disturbed. If we can tell our story to someone who really listens, we find it easier to deal with our circumstances. Anton Chekov brings home this message poignantly in his short story Grief and foregrounds the idea of listening as spiritual practice in human life. Ayana Patopov earns his living driving a horse-drawn cab or carriage or sledge, first to some passengers, then to someone he passes on the street, and finally to a fellow cab driver. This pained man repeatedly attempts to tell the story of his son who died just a week ago. But no one wants or no one is ready to listen to him. Iona has not really talked to anybody yet about this tragedy. He yearns to tell someone, anyone, about it, but there is no fellow human being who would listen to his story. Finally, Iona goes to the stables and begins his story or begins his story, storytelling or narrating to his horse. So how storytelling is important, how listening is important has been foregrounded by Chekov rather. Iona goes to the stables and begins his narrating to the horse, and we feel the desperate sadness with the grieved father. Chekov does not preach us about how sad this is or how wrong. He simply lays out the story and we are touched. Perhaps we are ashamed because all of us fail, we human beings fail to listen to each other. Placing the need for compassion and empathy for human beings towards their fellow human beings, Chekov begins the story with the question, which is an unusual way of beginning a story, because generally the story begins with some narration, but here this story begins with a question. And what is the question? Which has been raised by the writer as well as the writer is raising this question through the protagonist. The question is, to whom shall I tell my grief? Now the use of modal auxiliary shall is also very important, because through this shall the writer is perhaps trying to invite the reader's attention also here, and asks him very authoritatively how important it is to tell one's story and to listen others' stories. It tells us about the self-centered, unresponsive and heartless people in our surroundings, who are unkind to listen to their fellow human beings in this world. Grief means a great suffering of mind or body. Here, the suffering is not physical, but felt within the heart. There can be no cure for emotional distress unless it is let out and shared with others. Grief is a story of an old father's overwhelming grief, as I had pointed out earlier, and the overwhelming grief over the untimely death of his young son. Untimely because he is young, too young. And that is why at one place in the story he says that death went to the wrong door, which means that it went to the wrong person. Untimely death of his young son and his futile attempts to share it with the people around him. He is so overpowered or so overwhelmed with the grief within that he desperately longs to speak to someone and share his pain and agony. But ironically, no one is ready to listen to him. The old man has to keep his emotions within, as there are no listeners ready to listen to him or lend an ear of sympathy to his grief. He has been rendered alone by his son's death, but his loneliness increases when he finds no one with whom he can share his agony, his pain. The anguished heart wants to pour down its grief. He is severely alone and therefore miserable. The story describes the old man's yearning to share his grief with others, to unburden his grief-stricken heart, his despair at not being able to find a compassionate listener, and his final effort to find an outlet and relief for his miserable heart by talking to his mare or his horse, his one and only companion. In the first instance, Chekov describes the protagonist of the story, Iona Potapov, an old man in grief, who is a sledge driver or a cab driver. Iona is isolated from the rest of the world, rest of the mankind, rest of the humanity, because he has no one with whom to share his pain and reflect back upon the terrible event that would perhaps forever traumatize this old man in his life. No one seems to care for his sorrow. No one seems to care for Iona's sorrow. The other characters who appear briefly and then they disappear in the story. During the course of the story, Iona attempts to share his grief with them also. The other characters who appear briefly and disappear during the course of the story are either travelers in his sledge, in his cab, or they are people living along him in his surroundings who have neither the time nor the inclination to listen to him. They live in a world of their own and are heartless to empathetically relate to the old man's grief. The author relates how the old man's repeated efforts, recurrent efforts, time and again he makes an effort to catch the attention of the sledge riders or the passengers in his sledge, and again his efforts are thwarted, and how his failure to make them listen to his tale of agony and woe leaves him sad. The resulting emotion goes beyond grief and becomes misery. Grief weighs heavy on human beings. To relieve the psychological burden or emotional exertion on heart, it is very natural. It is important also, equally important as well as natural for human beings to seek someone's presence to share or talk out their feelings. Iona's misery stems from the sudden demise of his son a week ago, and he wishes to talk to others about the recent loss. Iona sits silent and alone, oblivious to the monstrosity of the winter, the extreme weather conditions in Russia. And extreme weather conditions in Russia could not make any influence on Iona or his loneliness, because he is very much occupied with the grief and pain. So Iona sits silent and alone, oblivious to the monstrosity of the extreme weather conditions of the winter evening. He is bent as double as the living body can be bent, as the snow falls and covers his whole body. The descriptions of the monstrous atmospheric surroundings or weather conditions and the human body, that is quite white. Human body is quite white because it has been covered with snow, and it looks like a phantom. The phantom or the ghost image also brings in the death imagery here. The first paragraph of the story becomes powerful in its description of the winter, because the coldness, the death, the inactivity, the immobility, the phantom-like appearance of a human being, the human body incapable of any mobility, all these things are associated together. They are brought together by the writer to foreground Iona's grief. As the story opens, his body, which is quite white and looks like a phantom, it conveys Iona's loneliness and suffering. And as the story opens, Chekov realistically portrays the severity of winter in Russia, because remember, he is a Russian short story writer, with its shades of darkness all around. The late 19th century evening in Russia is highlighted. It is highlighted by the atmosphere, the climate conditions in Russia, and mood informed by the white snow settling on every object in the surroundings. Every object living and non-living in those surroundings. is covered with snow, and it is speaking of the overwhelming grief of the central character of the story, the protagonist of the story, Iona. The cold, chilly atmosphere that engulfs the nature around is having direct connection with the harshness of human nature that strains human relationships. As the reader lives through the story with Iona and the people that he tries to talk with about his loss and grief, but they do not take care of his emotions and brush his misery aside, which is very painful. And that is why at one stage it seems as if the Chekov wants we human beings to feel ashamed of this cruelty or this indifference which we have cultivated, this self-centeredness to which I shall come later in ourselves. It is a miserably cold, misty evening with snow falling as the protagonist, Iona, and his little horse-drawn carriage wait for fare. The readers hear a lot of movement of people, but in the darkness no one is visible. Contrastingly, Iona is described as an inactive, immobile old man, bent double with age and grief, with a deadly silence within. He sits white like a ghost, and his mare also remain equally still and motionless. The animal is also described as motionless and still, just as the human being is described. And here in the very first stanza, through this similarity between the animal and the human being, the author has tried to convey to the reader the denouement of the story, what is going to happen at the end of the story. Because at the end of the story, it is only the animal which would be lending his sympathetic ear to Iona, not the human beings. And that is why there is a similarity set right in the beginning of the story. The writer, all around them, there is a constant movement of people who are not seen but whose voices are heard. But the old man and his horse remain motionless. The writer is thus able to focus on the loneliness of Iona, the sledge driver who is in need to talk to someone about his son's death, as I said earlier. He is surrounded by people and yet remains all alone in his grief because no one would listen to him. Here I am reminded of Francis Bacon, who is also described for you as an essayist. And in one of his essays, he said that a crowd is not a company and faces are but merely a gallery of pictures. The same happens here, that there are many people surrounding them, but they are merely faces who are not living beings because they are not behaving like living human beings. He is surrounded by people and yet remains all alone in his grief because no one would listen to him. The darkness around him is a measure of the darkness within him. He is like a ghost in white as he is covered with the snowflakes, which he doesn't care to shake off, for he experiences a death in life existence. The unkind indifference that Iona experiences in the story reveals the worst side of mankind, that is inhuman to their fellow human beings. The travelers in his cab are rude, unfeeling, indifferent, and uninterested in Iona's sorrowful state, and they act as if they do not hear what he has said. The silence of Iona is broken with the arrival of the first passenger, who is an army officer. He is in a hurry to reach his destination. He is a contrast to Iona in every respect. Iona is old and weary and grief-stricken, of course. The officer seems active and full of life and oblivious, indifferent to the grief. Whereas Iona is lost in grief, the officer jokes in a nonchalant and light-hearted mood. Nonchalant means indifferent, not ready to pay attention to anyone. Iona twists his mouth into smile and desperately desperately seeks the officer's attention and mentions to him that his son died last week. But the officer is more concerned to reach his destination and shows no interest in Iona. Rather, he reminds Iona to concentrate on his driving and move carefully and as fast as possible and drop him at his destination. The use of the verb twist is very important here because it is highly suggestive as the author desires to focus on the forced smile that Iona tries to wear on his face in this hour of sorrow. Next, Iona is approached by obnoxious alcoholic young man who wants to travel in his cab. They torment Iona throughout the ride with their loud and abusive language and show disrespect for the old man's emotions. This second group of travelers or passengers on Iona's cab is a bunch of three quarreling, noisy, rude, drunken young revelers who have no respect and sympathy for the old man when he tries to unburden his grief and be comforted with the thought that in the company of the young man of his son's age, because these three young men were almost of his son's age, he would temporarily seek some shelter from his grief, some relief from his grief, hoping that the young man who were almost of his son's age would lend him a sympathetic ear. He talks of his son's death, but unfortunately, none of them is ready to listen, and one of them relentlessly, heartlessly replies, "What if your son died? We shall all die." The devastated old father endures their rude behavior silently. Chekov says Iona hears rather than feels the blows they deal him. He hears rather than feels. There is a contrast here, foregrounded between hearing and feeling. We can always separate hearing and feeling. Sometimes the sounds can be coming to our ears, but we don't let them go inside. Because Iona's sorrow was too devastating to break his heart in comparison to the cruel mindlessness of these young men. Iona withdraws to his grief completely, hopelessly wondering if there is just one person who will listen to him and whether he could share his sorrow with complete strangers. But I begin a quotation here from the text. "The crowds hurry by without noticing him or his trouble," unquote. They were in fact insensitive to his pain and ridiculed his wretched state, lacking basic courtesy to share the grief of their fellow human being. According to Chekov, quote, "It is such an immense, illimitable grief. Should his heart break and the grief pour out, it would flow over the whole earth, it seems. And yet no one sees it. No one sees it. That is why the darkness. It has managed to conceal itself in such an insignificant shell that no one can see it even by day and within a light. The shell is a hard covering. If you have seen a walnut, that is walnut inside the kernel is inside, and the kernel is covered by that hard shell to protect the kernel. So there was a hard shell or covering which Iona has created around his heart, and people have also created shell around their hearts, and it is very difficult to break those shells. Disheartened by the unconcern and obliviousness to his sorrow, Iona then spots a house porter and tries again to engage the indifferent porter in conversation to get relief, but he could not gain any response from him and realizes that it is useless to turn to people for help. It is useless to turn to people for help, quote and unquote. The porter absolutely misinterprets Iona's reference to time, because Iona says that what time it is. Time, and dismissed the denotation of time merely to the clock time, rather than to understand Iona's perspective and interpret time connoted here in the sense of existing as an indifferent entity, a silent onlooker on human predicament. Next, Iona goes to the yard and tries to reach out to another cabman and engage him in conversation about his terrible grief. But the young man goes to sleep while Iona is talking to him. He doesn't give him any chance to say anything. Such nonchalance and callousness deepens the father's sorrow and augments means increases his urge to share his feeling without much delay. The only alternative left for desperate father is either to be off with all the possible condolences and commiseration for his sorrow and accept his I repeat once again, the only alternative left for desperate father now is either to be off with all the possible condolences and commiseration for his sorrow and accept his inconsolable grief with resignation. That is, he must resign to his grief, or find consolation to his unbearably painful within quotes, plight by talking to the animals that are more faithful than human beings. Finally, when Iona had been left with no strength to hold on to his innermost thoughts and emotions, he chooses the second option and goes to the stables to tell the tragic story of his son's death to his faithful horse. Quote and unquote, Iona's feelings are too much for him, and he tells the little horse the whole story. The horse seems to listen to his master while munching hay and shows warmth towards the bereaved heart as it breathes on the old man's hands on his palms. The old man finds relief in the company of his horse, sharing every detail slowly and carefully of, again begin quote, how his son fell ill, how he suffered, what he said before he died, how he died, and last but not least about his daughter, Anicia, who remained in the village with the mute animal. All these details he shares with the mute animal. This exchange of feelings comes as a purgation. It is a catharsis for him, for his grief, which strikes all human beings at some or the other stage in life. The story, finally to sum up, the story manifests human indifference and inability to console someone in as terrible a grief as Iona, who grieves for the untimely loss of his young son. Chekov addresses the indifferent mankind, lacking empathy for one another, as he depicts Iona's fruitless efforts to talk to a number of people he encounters as the story proceeds, but all failed. Right from the first passenger to the three young men, and then to the hall porter, and then again there is one more person to whom he tries to talk to. Four times he tries to open a conversation, but every time his efforts are defeated. So Iona's fruitless efforts to talk to a number of people he encounters as the story proceeds, but all failed to take notice of the heartbroken father's grief, as he is rendered helpless with the question, to whom shall I tell my grief? Iona miserably thirsts for a companion to talk about the tragedy. Human apathy forced Iona to turn to the companionship of an animal because he could no longer contain his loneliness and sorrow within. Having lost faith in humankind, that is deprived of feelings, he opted to communicate with his horse. That paradoxically proves a passive listener, yet an active companion. The horse is a passive listener but an active companion. And that active companionship is showed through his breath, which he releases on the palms of the old man, old father. So I once again go back. Having lost faith in humankind, that is deprived of feelings, he opted to communicate with his horse. That paradoxically proves a passive listener yet an active companion. And he found psychological comfort and relief for his grief ultimately. Sadly, the animal gives attention to the old man and reciprocated the feelings of love he badly needed when humanity, bereft of all kindness, turns away from him and shut all the doors of sympathy. The title of the story, Grief, accurately sums up the mood of Chekov's story, as the author successfully captures the agony of an old man whose bereavement has been followed by the recent death of his young son. It is quite natural, like all human beings, who needs to go to someone and cry and weep for a while in the hour of sorrow and distress. In the same vein, overwhelmed by his grief, Iona needs to speak to someone about his sorrow and unburden his heart, but the world around, with self-centered, unresponsive human beings, remains unaffected by the misery of the others, so long as it does not impinge on them at personal level. Iona feels a tender and sympathetic chord of love and understanding in his horse, white and motionless creature like him, as it breathes warmly on his hand. While not being able to find compassionate audience, he pours his burdened heart, filled with his son's memories, out to the animal. That's all about this discussion. You can read the story, the text itself, read this elaborate discussion which I have put on slides, listen to what I have discussed with you, and then look at the questions which have been given at the end of this slideshow. There are 2 slides, 10 questions are there. So read those questions and try to write answers to those questions with the help of this discussion, as well as the slide shows which have been elaborately describing what I have delivered in this talk. Thank you very much.